Excited to be here today. We've talked a lot so far about how to know if something is wrong with the systems that we work with. So now we're going to get into a little bit of what happens when that delightful pager goes off at 3 a.m., because it's always 3 a.m., and how to make sure that our responses to those pages are as efficient and effective as possible. So why am I here and why am I talking about this? I kind of will talk about this in terms of two careers. One is a software engineer at Bloomberg, where I work on a platform team supporting a bunch of the tools that our data scientists use to make sure all of the data that Bloomberg works with is available to our clients on a regular basis. And that includes responding to incidents. We need to make sure that this data is ready to go and mitigate any issues as fast as possible before customers find out. On the other side, I have what my friends affectionately refer to as my high-stakes hobby. I'm a lieutenant with the Alameda County Volunteer Search and Rescue Team. So I'm on call for missing person incidents, natural disasters, global pandemics, pretty much any sort of emergency you can think of within both Alameda County and the state of California. So that is a whole different kind of incident. Anytime we talk about incidents, I do want to start with a couple of these quick little disclaimers. Incidents often require a high degree of confidentiality when we talk about them, both from a technical business standpoint as well as from a medical or investigative privacy standpoint. So anything we talk about today is either going to be hypothetical or just be historical, only focused on publicly available information. Anytime we talk about emergencies, this can include some sensitive topics. There will be no graphic imagery or really in-depth graphic discussion. But again, if this is something that you're particularly sensitive to, I will not be offended if you decide it's time to get up and walk out. So just wanted to give you that heads up. Many companies have some sort of internal process framework for managing incidents. Some of these are strictly internal. You also have widely published frameworks. If we look at things like the Google SRE book, PagerDuty publishes a lot of their incident response protocols online. And then looking at Medium and all these other sites, you can find a lot of information out there. If you really dig into the roots of this, many of these frameworks actually have their roots in the Incident Command System, which is currently run by the Federal Emergency Management Agency under the Department of Homeland Security. And that's how we manage incidents at almost every level of emergency services throughout the United States and internationally. A little bit of history of where this comes from. In 1970, there was a huge firestorm in Southern California. So firestorm meaning a bunch of different wildfires in different places around the same time. And in the debrief after this incident, they discussed that it was tough to coordinate between all of the different agencies involved. Right, when you have that many fires going on, you have both the local fire departments, state, and even some like Forest Service National Resources involved. And they weren't speaking the same language, they didn't have the same protocols, so it was hard to work together. Out of this debrief, they developed a series of processes called California Fire Scope. And this stands for Firefighting Resources of Southern California Organized for Potential Emergencies. We love acronyms in emergency response. And this was their first attempt at some sort of multi-agency incident management system. Throughout the 70s, this evolved from just fires to what we call all hazards incidents. So looking at things like car accidents, terrorist actions, anything that might require a high degree of emergency resources. Throughout the 1980s, this was adopted nationwide, not just in California for firefighting. And then throughout the 90s, started to be adopted by other agencies, so the Coast Guard, police departments, throughout the country and even abroad. After 9/11, upon the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, this was adopted by FEMA as the nationwide standard for any sort of incident. And that continues on to this day. Anything from a local police department up through the federal government is going to be using the same management system. That way we can all work together when different resources get pulled in. This is not going to be an ICS training, so to speak. You can find actually a lot of that information online for free. But I wanted to talk a bit about some key concepts that we see in ICS. The first one is common terminology. We all need to be speaking the same language and avoiding some of the really niche technical jargon, because it makes it hard to communicate between teams and between agencies. We also want to look at command. And anytime we're getting out of our normal management structures, maybe how we work as a team, there comes the question of who is in charge. And in an emergency, you need to know who's in charge. So we talk about unity of command. So one person needs to be in charge. That way, you don't get into too much decision paralysis. Same thing when we talk about establishment, transfer, and termination of command. The time that someone is in command needs to be clear, and then when they're leaving command, that also needs to be clear, if that needs to get passed off to someone else. Again, that way we're not questioning where the decision's coming from in the heat of the moment. Management by objectives is also a big thing. We want to think about not what do we want to do, but what do we want our end result to be. We tend to get caught up in the kind of investigative, trying to figure out what's going on, even if that might not be the most pressing concern. So going back and thinking about those objectives helps keep us on the right path. Incidents can grow and contract, and that's why we think about modular organization. We want to be able to add and subtract resources as needed to deal with the correct scale of the incident. Accountability is an interesting one in this context. In the corporate world, we often think of accountability as you're doing what you are supposed to be doing and meeting certain standards. In the emergency services realm, we think of that a little bit more in terms of, are you physically where you say you're going to be? And we'll see how this plays out in an actual incident in a minute. In the spirit of common terminology, I want to get us all on the same page for what the process of an incident looks like. Again, this goes to different companies use different frameworks, different terms to talk about this, but for the purposes of this talk, this is how we're going to kind of look at it. So starting at the beginning, we have our pre-planning and preparation, our monitoring and alerting. These are the things that happen before any sort of incident takes place. The pre-planning and preparation being what you as a team, you as humans are doing, whether that's gathering documentation, setting up on-call schedules, etc. And then your monitoring and alerting is what's happening automatically behind the scene, right? What we've been talking about for the past 3 days. I do like to decouple alerting and notification. So alerting being what systems are telling you something is wrong, and then notification being how does that get conveyed to a human. And we'll get into a little bit more why that's important to decouple later. Check-in and briefing. So this might be acknowledging a page, basically how do you say, okay, I'm responding to this incident, and what's my quick 30-second elevator pitch about what's going on here. Assessing and planning being that early investigative stage, trying to figure out what's going wrong. Assignment being when you actually do something, whether that is rolling back a deployment, restarting a pod, that's the assignment. Assignment debrief, figuring out, did that work? And as you can see in my little graph here, these can be cycles. This is not really a linear process. We often go back to different stages in the process, and that's important. Check out and return to service. Incident's over, and we go back to whatever we were doing, usually sleeping. Last but not least is our incident debrief. We always want to go back and look at what happened and make sure that we are updating our pre-plans as needed, and we're updating our monitoring and alerting as needed based on what happened in the incident. So next we're going to look at two different stories. The first is about this little system we see here. And we're going to pretend that this is a system run by a couple engineering teams at a small news outlet. And the purpose of this is to pull data from X, formerly known as Twitter, and run some sentiment analysis on it. So then our reporters and people actually writing these stories can try to get a pulse on how people in different areas are generally feeling at a given time. So this might be looking at, on different sides of the aisle in Congress, or is there a more positive or more negative sentiment about a particular event? So we have our X API that we're interacting with, pretty simple API server, RDS database, using Airflow to run our actual analysis. And then there's a front end of some sort. I'm not a front end engineer, so the front end is just a black box labeled front end. We have 3 teams that are involved in this. Platform team, which is going to manage our database, our API server, the actual Airflow environment, and is responsible for writing our APIs. The data processing team is actually writing these airflow DAGs that do our sentiment analysis and then put it in the database appropriately. And again, the front end is like a black box that's managed by a different team. Our second story is about a missing person. We have a 35-year-old woman who went for a hike in Redwood Regional Park. This is a park in Oakland, near where I live. It's beautiful, lovely redwoods. I spent quite a bit of time there. And this woman was supposed to meet her friend for dinner and didn't show up. And this is unlike this friend. So her friend was really worried, reported her missing. And the police did find her car at a trailhead in Redwood Regional Park. Going into our pre-planning and preparation, how do we want to kind of be ready for something to happen? On the side of our missing person, there's a few things that we want to have in place. Right? I want to know a bit about the park ahead of time, know where my maps are. I need to have my equipment ready. If you look in my closet, I have my backpack of search and rescue gear that is perpetually packed. So I can run out the door and go in 30 seconds. Having contact information for different agencies involved and who could be in the area. In my county, in Alameda County, California, we have a lot of local police departments. We have the East Bay Regional Parks, has their own separate police department. And then we also have some we call lost person behavior information. There's been a lot of statistics gathering by a particular researcher, Robert Kester, about lost person behavior. And these statistics kind of provide us a good starting point for search planning based on the category of person, hiker, hunter, skier, et cetera, and some other factors about the terrain. Thinking about our technical system here. What are some things that we might want to have in advance and kind of be ready to access? Having some monitoring on that RDS database, being able to access that Airflow UI to see what's going on, server logs, as we heard about earlier, logs tell the story. And then if we are interacting with any sort of external service like the X API, being able to get status information about that. We've spent a lot of time talking about monitoring, so I'm not going to go too in-depth into this one, which is interesting. But looking at our database, we might have an alert on, for instance, high DB load. DB load is a metric that combines CPU usage, active sessions, and a few other things to provide a general idea of the health and load on your database. Right, so that can be useful to know if it's high. But what if this happens? 911 dispatchers have a concept of someone they call a frequent flyer. You see people who will call 911 repeatedly about really minor things, and this can happen for a variety of reasons. There could be some mental health challenges involved. People might not have good access to health care. Unfortunately, what this leads to is people then will take that person less seriously when they call 911. So that could be an issue in a real emergency. If our alerts become frequent flyers, we're not going to take them too seriously. So we need to tune a little bit. In this case, maybe we're using an actual metric as opposed to just high. And then we can also tune our notification appropriately. So this might be something that is a little bit concerning, and we want to know what's going on, but not quite wake you up at 3 a.m., kind of concerning. So if it's maybe a little bit higher than normal, that might be cause for a Slack notification. But then if it's really crazy high, that might be a situation for paging the on-call engineer. If we're looking at so high of a load that we're not going to actually be able to run queries against this database. So again, we're decoupling a bit of the alerting and the notification and making sure that the notification is appropriate for the level of concern about the alert. If we page people at 3 a.m. too often, they don't stay in jobs very long. So we've gotten an alert of some sort. In this case, we're going to go back to our technical system here, and front-end engineer sees this 500 internal server error. I know, really specific, one of our favorite HTTP error codes. And on the opposite side, my phone rings and it says, incoming call from SAR alert. I have a special ringtone for this. It's really, truly obnoxious. So we know what's going on there. And we have to figure out what to do with this information. There's three kind of things we want to establish when we get that alert. So first, who's in charge? And this leads back to our ICS concepts, our establishment, transfer and termination of command, and our unity of command. In this case, we're often, again, stepping outside of our normal management structures of our teams at work. So we need to make sure we're establishing who's in charge of the incident. Who's here to help? Who all should be involved? And this goes back to our accountability. And then, what's going on? This might be pretty obvious, but it also might not. For a missing person, in this case, we're in the East Bay Regional Parks. Their local police department is going to be in charge. And then for my search and rescue team, we have a command structure similar to what you might see in police, military, fire department. That way, highest ranking officer's in charge. It's pretty clear. Whoever's got the little stars and bars on their collar, that person's in charge. Pretty obvious. Who's here to help? We sign in a lot. We write our names on paper frequently. It's embarrassing if search and rescue loses people. So we want to know who's at command post. It's happened. We want to know who's at command post, who's gone out into the field, who's come back, who's gone home, etc. And we also, if I'm officer in charge, I need to check in with whoever's doing dispatch and say, who are we expecting to show up? We also don't want someone to get into a car accident on the way to the call. Also not good. What's going on? We'll get a quick briefing from whoever the police officer in charge, whoever's done the initial investigation, and this might be incomplete at the time. We may have some basic information about the subject, name, age, etc., but not much more beyond that, and we do our best with the information we have. Most of us also carry around a little checklist of questions to ask. I keep it in my wallet. It's like a little wallet-sized card. In the heat of the moment, again, 3 in the morning, you might not remember everything. So that little checklist can be very valuable in terms of keeping you on track. So then we get to our 500 internal server error here. Who's in charge? The front-end team initially found this, but are they going to run the rest of the incident? They might, and say, hey, we saw this, we're in charge, we're the incident commander. Or they might say, platform team, come on, this is your problem. It's a server error. You go be in charge. Either of those is fine, as long as it's clear who's in charge. In terms of accountability and who's there to help, this is something that different companies may have different policies for, whether you're joining a Zoom, like the war room, so to speak, logging into a Slack channel, but making sure if you log into that war room that you are actually present and ready to help, not I logged into the war room, oops, now I gotta go make dinner. If you're there, you're ready to help, maintain that accountability. And what's going on? In this case, we've said, okay, well, something's going on with that API server, it appears. So that's our best guess at this point, and that's the information we're going to work off of. Now it's time to do our little assessment. What is the initial information we have, and what are we going to do from here? So one of the first things that we might do in a missing person incident like this is send out an alert to people in the area, whether that's via like Nixle is one of these alerting services, or Nextdoor, and say, hey, there's a missing person in your neighborhood. If you see this person, call it in. Redwood Regional Park has some trails that feed out into different neighborhoods. So if someone maybe left the park by accident, someone might have seen them. The other thing we want to do is kind of look for some hints as to where this person might be. So there's a couple maps up here. In this case, we've discovered that our missing hiker is an avid user of Strava. And she's been to this park before and has recorded this route a few times. So that might be a good starting place. People tend to be habitual, so maybe she did the same loop she was planning on before. We're then going to turn that into a basic search plan. We're going to search some trails, and then we're going to look at some areas that might be common points where people might go off trail. There's a little peak up here, and people tend to go off trail a little bit there to explore the peak, so it's a bit of a mess up there. We did a few things in this initial assessment and plan, and this is going back to our management by objectives. What do we need to happen first? The first thing we did, sending out this alert, stopping the bleed. We want to stop this situation from getting worse, and ideally keep this person from wandering further and further from the initial point where they started. It's harder to find a moving target. Then we're looking for clues, not just the root cause. You can't just run out into the park and say, we're going to find the person. There's too much territory for that. So we need to think about things like, in which direction did they travel? Where are they likely to be? On this trail, do we see a clear spot where someone may have skidded off the trail? There's like a butt slide mark in the dirt and a bunch of brush that's crushed down. It's not the person, but it's a clue and can eventually lead us to the right solution. In the case of our 500 internal server error here, stopping the bleed might include disabling those front-end functions that use the impacted API. We don't want to just have a ton of error calls coming in, and if we're looking at something that could be a potential load issue, that is only going to make the situation worse. So our front-end team might decide to like gray out those functions or whatnot. Again, it's a front-end black box. I assume they can do that. Then we're going to start looking for clues. When was our last deployment? Have we changed something about our API server recently that might be problematic? How about other services that we interact with? Our database, Airflow. What about the X API? There's been some interesting things going on at X recently. In this case, we found that the X API made some changes to their response format and the data that's available in those responses we're getting. And there weren't really any release notes or a message about that. So, unfortunately, our system wasn't able to handle it. But at least we have a cause now. Our plan can change upon new information. What if upon further investigation we found out that that hiker went out hiking with her boyfriend? He came back, but she's still out there somewhere. What if this system that we're looking at, instead of serving like 20 reporters within our company, serves 2 million customers? That might require interacting with, say, a customer liaison team and changing some of our messaging that we're getting out. Here we're thinking about our modular organization. So yeah, we need to involve the client liaison team. And then in the case of our missing hiker, that might be something we pass more over to the police. Some suspicious circumstances, maybe. This is where common terminology plays in a lot. When we're interacting with our client liaison team, they're not really going to know what 500 internal server error means. Maybe not even changes in JSON format. So we want to try to avoid that jargon and word things in a way that non-technical folks can understand as well, to be able to craft messaging appropriately and, again, work together. These problems can become quite big. Now it's time to do something. Our favorite part as engineers, we like to get our hands dirty, we like to do things, we like to solve problems. And again, this is something we're always thinking about in a loop. So this plan, do, check, act loop is common in the medical field. Again, always thinking about we're doing something and then we're checking to make sure our actions actually had an impact in the way that we wanted them to. Documentation also becomes critically important here, the more people who get involved. So we want to make sure we're writing down who's involved, what is their role, who's the incident commander, who are the subject matter experts, who's our client liaison, what's the timeline of this? When did it start? How long did it take us to get through particular stages? What are those incident objectives we're working off of? What are we doing for short-term mitigation? What's the root cause? We're already starting to see these things pile on. There's a lot to remember. There's a lot going on. So writing that down, again, 3 a.m., no one's at their best. We are going to need to look back into our documentation. We have our two little assignments and assignment debriefs here. In the case of our missing person, a team went out to search one of those trail assignments we saw on the map earlier. They found nothing. No information is relevant. It's good to know what's wrong, and it's good to know what the cause is. It's also good to know what the cause is not. So this might say, okay, we're not going to focus additional resources in that area because we're really not seeing anything. There's hikers in the area. No one saw our missing person. So there's a high likelihood that she's not there. In the case of our technical system, we are able to push some changes, and now we're going to test it. Again, getting that feedback and making sure that our actions actually had the impact we want them to. Now comes the big question. When's the incident over? So a little story here. I don't know if anyone has either read the book or seen the TV show 5 Days at Memorial. And this book TV show chronicles what happened at Memorial Hospital in New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And they had plans. They had, their whole incident action plans and such. One of the nurses there, Susan Muldrick, was appointed to be incident commander. She was incident commander for 5 days. I don't know what the longest you've ever been involved in an incident is, but I'm willing to bet it's less than 5 days. You need a nap somewhere in there. And sometimes you need to leave the incident before it's over. That's okay. 5 days as incident commander is too long. You're not going to be able to think straight or be effective. So when we think about this checkout and return to service, again, going back to this establishment, transfer, termination of command, and accountability, sometimes you need to step away. That is totally fine. Let people know where you're going. Say, hey, I have to log off to take my kid to school. Or, yeah, I do need to get dinner, actually. Transfer your command, transfer your responsibilities to someone else. In emergency services, we have this concept we call operational periods. So you have a team that's running the incident for usually around 12 hours, and then they pass off to a whole nother team that then takes over for the next 12 hours. There's a handoff, and this is important to keep people fresh and keep people actually able to be effective. It's something we don't as much think about when we're sitting at computers. So you're like, oh, I'm not there running around, I'll be fine. But your brain does start to not think quite as straight after a little while. Last but not least, we get to debriefing. This is where we get a lot of information. As you can see from our debriefs up here, we're looking at a couple different things. We're looking at both how can we improve our systems. So in the case of our missing hiker, we found the area where she was found has a lot of these random offshoots and trails that aren't really trails. And this is something where park maintenance might be able to come in and clean up a little bit to avoid other people getting off in the same area. We're also looking at how can we improve our handling of things. So in the case of our technical incident here, should that alert have just been routed to the platform team in the first place? The front-end team says, yeah, why'd you wake us up? But that's important. We don't want to have people who maybe don't necessarily need to be involved in incidents getting those alerts. When we talk about debriefing, I like to use a quote from Ted Lasso. And he's talking in this scene about how he likes to interact with and get to know people. He says, be curious, not judgmental. As much as we love our get blame and everything, we do want our debriefs to be focused on how can we learn from this and not whose fault it is. That creates a safer space in our team where people feel comfortable speaking up and people feel comfortable being involved because they aren't worried about their actions being judged later. So whenever we talk about debriefing, be curious, not judgmental. And that'll help our teams function a little bit better. As a quick follow-up, I've linked some of the resources I mentioned earlier in the talk here. This will be available in the Slack channel later this evening. And thank you so much.
All right, great job. Do we have any questions? Got one right here.
Great talk. I'm curious about the incident command system you mentioned. Like, is there standard software that different agencies use, and how does it compare to what you use in your engineering?
Is there a standard system of software that these places use?
So a lot of this is actually still fairly paper-driven. Because we do work in a lot of sort of austere environments where access to the internet is not necessarily guaranteed. So there is like standard forms and paperwork.
Much like this venue.
Yeah. And you can find some pieces of software designed around like populating these forms. Honestly, my team uses like an Excel plugin type situation. or we use for mapping a piece of software called CalTopo that then integrates with some of this ICS paperwork. It's very much a, teams use the standard forms, and those are widely recognized, but the actual like technical implementation of those really very much depends on the environment that you work in. So, like, I've seen, we've worked with a fire service that has their terminal for populating these. But it varies on what resources your agency is going to have available and what kind of environment you're going to be in. If I'm off in the middle of nowhere and barely have a Starlink connection, I'm writing stuff down physically.
Yeah, right here.
First off, thank you for all the work you and your peers do in search and rescue. Offshoot, I guess, on your question a bit, do you have any documentation you refer to as when you're in an incident or search and something like that? Like besides just the tooling, do you have other things you just have in your pack, so to speak?
Yeah.
Do you have any documentation that you keep for this process?
Yeah, so on the search and rescue side, they're called like incident response pocket guides. They're a little like notebook size, essentially cheat sheet of a lot of things. I don't have in my brain what size landing zone we need for a Black Hawk helicopter, but I do want to be able to look that up if need be. So that usually goes in either my pants pocket or my pack. I can pull it out. And again, like at work, we have a lot of stuff in the headers of Slack channels in terms of how we interact with our systems or what things are customer facing or not. But again, having that accessible is really the big thing.
I think there's one right here.
So I guess safe to say we're the team in this whole analogy at 3 a.m. How does your company establish who we're team 2 is?
How does your company establish like who you assign to the team?
At the end of their shift and goes, we can't work anymore. Who do they call in?
Like how do you basically transition the incident team? Like during mid-incident?
Intervention team. Basically the people go in to save the people who were there first.
So the way our on-call schedules work is we always have primary and secondary. So if primary needs to step away, they'd hand off to secondary, and then secondary presumably has some time to kind of figure out who's up next. So I mean, technically my manager is always third on the list. But yeah, usually it's primary would escalate to secondary, and then maybe go back to primary if primary's had some time away. But having that clear escalation policy can be really important.
Good question. Yeah, right here. Cool.
Which one's more stressful?
Which one is more stressful? Ooh, that is a great question.
I'm going to say the work with search and rescue. I always, when my teammates at work get stressed about incidents, I'm like, yeah, but nobody's dying. And I don't even have to put on pants most of the time. So I will say that the working in search and rescue does lead to you being much more laid back about incidents and other aspects of your life.
I mean, how stressed out can you be in sweatpants, right? Great. I think there's one right here.
Have you ever had situations where either multiple people are trying to be in charge or that no one wants to claim being like an incident manager person?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so have you ever had a scenario where either many people want to be incident manager or no one did?
Oh, yeah. Happens all the time. And in my company, like the platform team was usually the first response. And people have gotten to know that, me especially, I'm very comfortable coming in and saying, my incident, I'm incident commander, you will now listen to me. Thanks so much.
Thanks for coming in.
Yep. But yeah, sometimes we do have, multiple people are logging in and kind of trying to figure out who's in charge. And a lot of that comes back to training and helping people realize that often in engineering teams, right, we like to be collaborative. We like to work together. We like to hear everyone's ideas. But in an emergency situation, establishing, yes, one person's in charge and making the decisions, it's a mindset shift. And that can be difficult for some people to grasp. And again, this is one people at work joke about, yeah, Lieutenant Thoreson is coming out today. When I start bossing people around unnecessarily, maybe.
We got time for one more question? Just check if there's anything else up top. I think we're good. Nope. I'm not missing anyone? No one's pointing to one direction. Awesome. Let's give another big round of applause. Thank you so much.